It's warfare that is desperate for an enemy because it doesn't know how to exist without one. That's where we are right now, is we don't know how to exist. And by that, I mean how to make sense of the world and how to make meaning in the world without an enemy. And that is an incredible enslavement that we have willingly walked into.
Jesus is the scapegoat, right? He is condemned, though innocent, he is condemned as the guilty one, and he is expelled and crucified. Yet he is actually victorious over our deepest enemy, not the tribe we don't like, but our deepest enemies of sin, death, and the devil.
When our post-everything world has turned life upside down, how do you even know which end is up?
If you're committed to a community or a cause greater than yourself, you don't have the luxury of checking out or the freedom to burn out.
It's not enough to just keep surviving. We need to thrive again.
This is Post Everything,
a podcast about remapping culture and rethinking leadership in a liminal age.
Welcome to Post Everything. I'm John Houmes, and I'm here with my co-host, Brad Edwards. Hey, Brad.
Hey, good to see you, man.
Hey, man, our friend Trevin Wax wrote an article on the Gospel Coalition website on April 9th called When the Tribe Eats the Church. Good article.
Really good article. Very provocative title, but it actually really kind of resonates with several of the themes that we've been talking about since day one on Post Everything. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So let's talk about that. He talks about tribes and tribalism. And in one of his other articles, he quotes Alan Noble, who we also just had on the podcast. And Alan Noble has a great way to think about how tribes actually function, because he identifies several of them. So he says tribes can be Swifties, MAGA. It can be the anti-woke Christian Twitter warriors, the social justice warriors. It can be LGBTQ plus identity groups, intellectual groups, geographic groups, theological groups. It can be No Kings protesters or Christian nationalists or anti-Christian nationalists. Tribes can cover everything from politics to religion. But when we think about tribes and how splintered our society is, we're not just thinking about Christianity as a tribe, although I guess you could say it is, nor are we just thinking about a denomination like Baptists or Presbyterians, and probably not even thinking that in specifically as networks within those denominations, but rather a very small group within that denomination where splitting hairs has become a mark of identity. So we're not just talking about like wokeness or a response to wokeness as an example. We are seeing that the various ways to oppose wokeness can create 6 or 7 tribes. The various ways to respond to Christian nationalism can sort out different tribes. So it's very interesting to think about tribalism. But Brad, how did we get here?
Yeah, so we're talking about this article because you just gave a good kind of explanation of tribalism and also like just what we mean by the word tribes and how Trevin is using that word in his article. But the reason the article really kind of popped on our radar, and I think it's really fascinating, is the way that he's connecting this to expressive individualism. Because tribalism itself is not new. It's like I was just talking to somebody about they're doing a rewatch of The West Wing, and I asked him if it had if it aged well since then. And he said, like, yes, actually it is, because it's no less tribal. Like the tribe still exists. We still fight with people who we're trying to co-labor with. Like that's not shocking. That's not a new thing. Nothing's new under the sun anyway. But what has changed and what does feel very different is the way that tribalism has become an ultimate source of meaning, and the way that we are using group identity as a way of deriving significance, meaning, and purpose, which is actually that's an institutional muscle we're kind of using again, but we're using it not as a way of belonging to an institution, but as a way of joining a crowd, right? So let me back up though, and quote Trevin Wax in this article for how he connects that to expressive individualism. He says, now that the, quote, find yourself and express yourself philosophy has largely exhausted itself, and I think, just to pause there, I think there's something to that. I think we've talked about how there's this like exhaustion post-pandemic that, much of that has cleared up in the time since, but there's kind of a baseline level of exhaustion that feels like it is not fully gone away and doesn't seem to be moving. It seems here to stay, and there's something to that, I think. To go on, he says, we're being drawn toward group identity to fill the void of significance and meaning that a self-generated identity cannot sustain. That makes a whole lot of sense to me, because part of what a healthy attachment to an institution and a membership belonging to an institution like the church, part of the gift and the benefit of that is that you can kind of see yourself in others. Like you can see your values and the things that you believe are ultimately important and good and beautiful in the world. And you get to experience them in a community. So it's not just all on your shoulders. So there's a sense that impulse is really good. But the problem is where it's being directed and the way that it's often very graceless, right?
Okay.
So yeah, does that make sense? And does that kind of mesh with how you're reading this too?
Yeah.
Cool. So
go on.
Yeah. Happily, always. So it's funny reading this. I was like, man, I actually, this is a perfect pair. This article perfectly pairs with an article I wrote almost a year ago now for the Dispatch called "The Empty Ecstasy of Digital Crowds." And toward the beginning of it, I kind of jump off something that Eugene Peterson wrote. He said in his book, The Pastor, that there are historically three ways we glean religious meaning apart from God. Quote, through the ecstasy of alcohol and drugs, through the ecstasy of recreational sex, and through the ecstasy of crowds, end quote. And then I continue on and say, you don't have to be a stage performer to understand why crowds can be dangerously seductive. Crowds are easy. They offer affirmation without vulnerability, attention without sacrifice. The only responsibility incurred in belonging to a crowd is reciprocating attention, and you have to give it to get it. No one joins a crowd to be challenged or constrained, only affirmed and validated. Nothing is asked of anyone that they don't already want to give. And so this, like I said, this is very much like institutional belonging, but it's a combination of two things. It's performative, and that's where the attention piece comes from, but it's also very disposable. In the sense that like you can chuck it or leave that crowd. You can leave that tribe if it goes in a direction that you disagree with or is in some way at odds with your expressive individualistic impulse to achieve your significance, meaning, and purpose from something, right? So that's why there can be such a serious backlash if a crowd or a tribe changes direction on you, and it can be an even greater and more volatile response sometimes, even than you can see in response to a tribe that you are against in some way, right? And that's because part of and we've talked about this before too, in the way that identity politics and political polarization in general is really happening. Because we have taken on a posture of making meaning by making enemies, right? Yeah. Because frankly, I think we're adrift societally and culturally. I think there's this meaning crisis that we've talked about off and on over the last year and a half, especially. I think is continuing, and I think that it's part of the reason why we're seeing this is because what Facebook and Twitter or X and Instagram, what all social media platforms do, is they algorithmically curate and deliver to you an endless supply of enemies, and even friends that you disagree with, so that it uses the narcissism of small differences to generate outrage and therefore extract your attention. So if that's the way that we have been kind of, digitally and liturgically formed and shaped for the last 15 to 20 years, then it makes sense that we would default to a kind of a rediscovery of this institutional belonging muscle, but toward crowds and tribes rather than institutions or anything embodied, honestly. So
talk about that real quick. The difference between the good of belonging to an institution and how that helps us make meaning in the world versus how maybe a tribe that you're part of, you might not even be, I guess one of the differences, you might not even be part of it in like embodied life. You're part of it online.
That is the $1 million question. And that's why I just drives me crazy. Like online church isn't, right? Online church isn't, because when you remove something from the material into the digital, you're disembodying it in a way that thins out the goodness and actually amplifies the badness of that thing. Because it's made up of humans, it's going to have both, right?
Yeah.
But that's what happens when it kind of escapes the gravitational pull of material embodiment and goes into the digital realm. But let me quote Eugene Peterson again, because I think this is really helpful. He says, digital crowds, or this is me speaking, I'll name the quote when it starts. Digital crowds are so tempting because universally, quote, we hunger to escape the dullness, the boredom, the tiresomeness of me. That's how Peterson talks about crowds, right? And then I go on, but escape is a poor substitute for transcendence. A crowd, Eugene Peterson says, takes us out of ourselves, but not to God, only away from him. We can escape upward or downward. Drugs and depersonalized sex are a false transcendence downward. A crowd is an exercise in false transcendence upward, which is why all crowds are spiritually pretty much the same, which is why we have horseshoe theory.
Yeah.
Which is why we did that whole episode on like the right-wing woke versions of critical theory and the left-wing woke versions, and why those things bear a remarkable amount of similarity. It's just a different it's different lines drawn on the battlefield, but it's the same battlefield.
Yeah, and sometimes the same way of approaching battle.
Even
though the beliefs are different.
Yeah, it's warfare that is desperate for an enemy because it doesn't know how to exist without one. Like literally, that's where we are right now. Is we don't know how to exist, and by that I mean how to make sense of the world and how to make meaning in the world without an enemy, and that is an incredible enslavement that we have willingly walked into.
Yeah, that's good.
So.
Well,
it's great, wonderful. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, no, your analysis was good. The state of our society is not good.
Well, but I do want to I think there is something to affirm in this.
Okay.
And Trevin Wax, in one of the articles he linked in the one we're talking about, that article is called "Looking Up in the Age of the Crowd." Like, I would encourage everybody to go back and read these in the chronological order that he wrote them, because I think there's even more that can be gleaned by seeing how his evolution of thought and his observations strung together like that. It's so helpful. But in that article, he says both the expressive individualist and the identity politics devotee are functioning at some level as frustrated idealists. They yearn for a better world, a world that's freer, more accepting, more communal. They're exhausted by the gap between what they long for and what they see. They're angry that the world that they want hasn't arrived yet, and they often assume something or someone is holding them back. Right? This is why that the only thing you need to gather a crowd is a plausible source for your grievance, to point your finger at someone and say, this is the reason why this is the enemy that is responsible for the gap between the world as it ought to be and the world how it is. Right? You don't hate them enough. We've all seen this language online. Like, you don't hate the media enough. You don't hate MAGA enough. Like, whatever it is, that is making meaning by making enemies. And you can gather incredible crowds around that, because that is what the incentives of social media make easy. But it doesn't build, it only burns down.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that even goes into churches. So, like, you can start a church and you can gain a crowd if you're against something politically, and that's part of the foundation of who you are. Or even there was I'm not sure if this is still the trend, but there was a time where it's like, we're not going to do traditional church. We're that kind of church. Like, we're against traditional church. And like, there was something actually good about that, because it was contextualization. It was contextualizing, spirituality for the place that it was trying to plant the church. But at the same time, I think everyone you can form deep bonds if you have a common enemy. And ultimately, the church is not about what it's against. It starts with what it's for. We've talked about this before. I won't go into it again.
Well, no, I mean, I don't. We didn't discuss everything that we're going to talk about in this episode before hitting record. But it feels like you're targeting me, John, because I don't know if I've said it on here before, but like there are some things I really regret about the way I approached church planting for our first 3 or 4 years. Yeah. And we had a whole lot of people who came through our doors who I would describe and summarize as refugees of evangelicalism. Yeah. And I think that is both cause and effect for the ways in which I probably said, like, your experience of church might be this, but this is what the gospel says. And in ways that, like, okay, that might be descriptively true, but when you root the meaning and significance of the gospel in a complaint, in an objection, in a negative vision, an anti-vision, it's going to distort the gospel in ways that you're not intending, and it's going to make that belonging a whole lot more fragile, because that's essentially what part of what happened at the table. I think is that when we stopped doing that, people started getting really anxious and worried that, like, and hearing things that I wasn't saying in a lot of ways. Because they were worried we didn't share the same enemies anymore. Yeah, it's like, well, they weren't enemies in the first place. They were neighbors. We're called to love them, but that's not how it translated.
That's interesting, and I think one of the things that happens when an institution or an organization is formed around being against something, or let's say this, being for something, people want to make sure and fill in the gaps of what you're not saying. I want to be clear on who we're against here. Such as happens. I think there's a lot of other interesting implications from what Trevin wrote. One of the things that I was thinking about is just how he captures what's happening in our moment, where these splinter groups, these tribes that are forming, and by that I don't mean, like, when I say splinter groups, I don't mean like someone on the fringe. I mean, like, we're all in it, right? But what ends up happening is they become echo chambers that exercise groupthink, because they refuse to wrestle with new ideas, because those new ideas undermine the ideological vision of the group. So new ideas are treated with suspicion rather than charity. And what actually happens with that is the groupthink and the echo chambers become smaller, because they're not actually wrestling with other ideologies or other ideas. They're just saying, we don't have to wrestle with that because those guys are obviously bad. So they end up wrestling less and less with the arguments of real people, and they end up preaching to the choir to people that already believe and share the same enemy they do.
Yes. Well, and that's the whole, I think, is it Nietzsche's narcissism of small differences, right? And also, Mike Graham talked about this in his Six-Way Fracturing article that is now a classic, and I think has a heck of a lot of explanatory power. Is that, like, you don't actually direct your anger or frustration. You don't identify, like, the people that you see as enemies are often the people who are most closely share, but are only just a little bit off. But that little bit offness, that gap, becomes and feels threatening because it feels representative of the larger gap of what we see in the world. And so that's where all the slippery slope arguments come in. Like, oh, you're sliding right wing woke, or you're sliding left wing woke, and this is going to become a liberal denomination or whatever else. Like, these are the root for all of that stuff, right? Is anti-vision. And if your primary associations, if your co-laborers are only found, connected to, and the discourse happens on social media platforms, that liturgy is, and those incentives are going to shape and form you accordingly. Your why will become distorted. We have to have a primary anchor in an embodied institution, in a local church, for you and I being Presbyterian, in our presbyteries. It's so important.
Yeah, and I think a result of that, or another implication of the article too, is that sometimes tribal concerns get attached as non-negotiables in the faith in Christ. So they function. It's hard to see this in a moment, but they end up functioning like a competing gospel. That the real gospel, the gospel of Jesus, the good news of the kingdom, must now validate without confronting or even rearranging or reprioritizing. So, I mean, you see this in all sorts of ways, like going into the election season, like my pastor better say this on Sunday, right? He better say, and I mean, you could fill in the blank with a million different things.
If your pastor didn't mention blank in their sermon last Sunday, you need to find a different church.
Gosh, that happens all the time.
World.
And it's also a little bit myopic because the world is so vast with so many different concerns. And one of the reasons why the online world screws us up so much is because it gives us the sense that we're everywhere at once, rather than sometimes there are big concerns that aren't a big concern at some churches just because of where they are in the world, where they're located. There's a reason that we don't talk about Indian politics in the Assam region below Bhutan on Sunday morning, whereas that would be a huge deal to somebody else. Most people don't know where the Assam province is. So
I didn't know it existed.
Yeah, well, I've been there once.
Okay, well, hey,
I don't know
awesome.
anything about the politics. That's just what popped into mind. But I think that's a good example of just saying, in one sense, we're so rooted. In another sense, we're everywhere at once. And that really distorts what's even important. So these issues get attached to the faith, and they become tribal non-negotiables. How dare my pastor not mention that on Sunday?
Well, and we've talked about this before. I wrote about it in my book in the Uncivil Religions chapter about how, right around 2016, 17, when someone was like, "Hey, pastor, can we grab, coffee or a beer sometime?" And I just want to ask questions about the church. It looks like it's a new person trying to figure out, where is the church? It went from, theological questions of why do you baptize babies? That's a really good question. And also we're going to need a beer to talk about that because it's going to take a little bit. But at some point it changed. It feels like it changed overnight. And it was not theological questions or tests. Not tests is too strong of a word, but like probing on alignment was not. It went from theological to social and political, overnight. It felt like, and that is what you're talking about. That's
Yep.
how when we are so bombarded by disagreement, our ability to tolerate or be charitable in the midst of disagreement in person is significant. It's exhausted. And so we have less tolerance for it. We have less patience for it. It's not seen as a good thing. It's seen as oh God, the things I saw online are now here in my church or in my world. And there's an understandable fear about that. The problem is that we don't understand that fear is actually coming from algorithms that are delivering that to us, not pastors and sermons.
Yeah.
Or not institutional leaders in general.
Yeah. So, okay, thinking about this a little bit further, I've been trying to reconcile this with some of Tim Keller's thinking. So, I first was exposed to Tim Keller in 2001, blew my mind. Keller's vision and his mantra was the gospel touches everything. The gospel isn't just the ABCs of Christianity, it is the A to Z. So it was like this gospel went out. And now I'm still trying to find words for this, Brad, but it's almost like it's now been inverted. It's like the gospel no longer reframes the concerns of the tribe. Rather, the tribe judges the gospel based on its concerns, which is kind of an implication of what I'm saying about if your pastor didn't mention this on Sunday, So tribal loyalties are now non-negotiables as part of the gospel, and the tribe sits on judgment. The tribe sits in judgment almost on the brand of Christianity and how it handles political issues.
No, I mean, I think it. My bad. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I don't think you're wrong on that. I'm want to interrogate that a little bit because I think that's really interesting. But to affirm and agree with that first, we've talked before about Michelle Margolis, her book from politics to the pews. And part of her thesis around that book, and this is a data-driven, very, very deeply and peer-reviewed research that drives her thesis in this. Her thesis is that at some point around 2010-ish, probably, we started to see a significant transition and a flip from people's instead of people's religion informing and shaping their politics, the other way around. And that she attributes that to a change in what we consider to be our primary association. So our political associations becoming primary and more ultimate than our religious or denominational associations, which actually makes sense because that's really like we had seen at that point an entire generation or two shaped by a non-denominational movement that said, denominations and larger tribes religiously are not as important. And I think that one of the trade-offs of that is that when you don't have a larger association religiously beyond your church, that you're not part of a tradition and you're not rooted in that way outside of and in addition to your church, through your church, then politics just fills that vacuum. Tribal political identity fills that vacuum and becomes primary. And so I think there's something really to that. I also think that maybe something, and I don't know if this is a pushback on what you said or another agreement, actually, but there's something about, I think, the spiritual pragmatism and the seeker-sensitive movement that has said we're going to not talk about the political implications of a thing that has also created a vacuum. And we are, in ways that I don't think Tim Keller even remotely intended. And this is not Tim Keller doing this at all.
Yeah.
He but I think the way some people have taken Tim Keller's thought and applied it has absolutely said we're just not going to engage with politics, and so that actually communicates implicitly something that that we can go and like the church has nothing to say about politics because politics transcend it.
Right.
And I think that's wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, and we've talked about that before. I mean, the third way was never an absence of politics, although some have chosen that path.
Yeah.
Right. But it was rather a different way to engage all of life, right? The Kuyper's every inch of creation is mine, says the king.
Yeah.
So, Brad, I have been reading René Girard's book, I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, which my wife says is the most intense title for a book she's ever heard.
Yeah.
So Girard was a French academic, a literary critic, an anthropologist who passed away in 2015. His work became an apologetic work for Christianity. And his book, I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, came around in 2001. Now, I think there's some connections between Girard's thought and Trevin's article. But I say this with trepidation because everyone that I've learned about Girard from, all the Girard experts say, hey, I'm not an expert on Girard, and then they teach you stuff. So if I'm learning from these guys, like I'm definitely not the expert. So I hope to get everything right. But so Girard was really famous and well known for this idea of mimetic desire. And what he meant by that was that desire isn't independent. Desire doesn't come from us being a tabula rasa. Rather, it's mimetic. We learn what we should desire through imitation, through imitating those around us, those closest to us. As people pursue different things in their life, like let's say a career path, we learn that career path might also be something that we desire because they desire it. Now, a great book that came out in 2021 was by an author named Luke Burgess, who unpacks this really well. He actually explains Girard in a really understandable way. The book's called Wanting, The Power of Mimetic Desire in Everyday Life. Both you and I have read it. Great book. But the key point is desire doesn't just come from inside of us. It comes from what we learn to desire. But then what ends up happening with that mimetic desire is that it turns into a mimetic rivalry. Here's why. Two groups or two people end up wanting the same thing. Now, maybe one person or one group learned to want that thing from the other group, but once they both want it, they both can't have it. And so the desire continues to grow, but then the thing desired becomes less important than beating the other person to the thing that is desired. So what ends up happening is the desire shifts, and the desire, the rivalry between the two groups who want the same thing becomes the defining characteristic. Now, here's where I see a little bit of overlap between Wax and Girard, Trevin Wax and Girard's thinking, because society is really a mishmash of these mimetic rivalries. We talked a little bit about it when you mentioned horseshoe theory, but society could be seen as groups that may want to beat their rival more than the thing that they were originally desiring. So political victory is no longer around some desired vision of flourishing, but that we must stop our rivals. We have to get to power before they do.
I think you were right to see that connection. In fact, while you were talking, I remembered a section of one of the articles, the earlier articles that Trevin Wax kind of wrote on his way to the one we're talking about today. And in it, he quotes he says, as Musa al-Gharbi, who's a sociologist, has argued, many of today's fiercest identity-based conflicts function less as movements for justice and more as status competitions among elites who already hold cultural power.
Wow,
when material
yes.
needs are largely met, but deeper
Yes.
questions of meaning, purpose, and belonging go unanswered, moral fervor rushes in to fill the gap. What looks like compassion for the oppressed often masks a deeper struggle among the well-off to justify themselves, distinguish themselves, and be a part of a cause that feels morally serious. And we've talked about this same dynamic. Oh gosh, I'm totally blanking on the name of the book. End Times. I can't remember the author, but I got the name of the book, so we can look that up later. But part of his thesis is that societies go through these phases, and he traces them through since between the American Revolution to present day. And he says that there's always this period of what he calls elite overproduction. Right?
Peter Turchin?
Yes, Peter Turchin.
Yeah, Turchin.
And he argues that this dynamic of elite overproduction is basically like we've actually gotten wealthy enough as a society that the promise of economic progress and climbing the ladder starts to feel really empty because there's not actually enough positions to occupy. And it's more like a game of musical chairs, but instead of you know how after every round somebody doesn't find a chair, you take a chair out, but whoever doesn't get the chair leaves the game and they lose. This dynamic is not just taking the chair out, but that person actually stays in the game, and you add a person also at the same time you take out a chair. So there are more competitors for a decreasing number of chairs. Let's just for a moment recognize that there are some serious implications for what AI is supposed to do to the economy over the next 5 years if the accelerationists and the optimists are right. That dynamic is only going to accelerate. It's only going to create more grievance, more populism, and more existential angst across the board in our politics and in our day-to-day life, because we're constantly bombarded with people who we don't believe deserve a seat at the table, and we don't because we don't get a seat at the table. That just increases that frustration.
Yeah, that actually dovetails into where Girard's thinking went next. So again, people desire the same thing. Then when they find out someone else desires the same thing, the rivalry becomes where the desire is formed around and heads towards. So then Girard's really famous for also this idea of the scapegoat mechanism. So when two communities or two groups of people or two tribes are chasing after the same thing, there is this rivalry that often creates chaos in a community. I'll give some examples in just a minute, but the community and the group reaches a breaking point because of this rivalry with another group. And very quickly, a whole community can unite not behind a single person, but rather against a single person, aka the scapegoat. And what ends up happening is that scapegoat is identified, convicted, and expelled from the community. But once that happens, once the scapegoat is expelled, actually it brings order and peace back to the group rather than the tension and the chaos. And here's what Girard was really interesting and maybe provocative for thinking. He thought that the scapegoat mechanism actually became foundational for societies and religions to form. Tribes form based on having someone to blame, then expelling them, because the people actually find unity in expelling the scapegoat. And they have a deep sense of peace together now that the scapegoat has been expelled.
I just had this thought. Do you think that's why, in some ways, there's less to spare but more anger after Trump got elected the second time, because he was a scapegoat that was expelled and now he's back in some ways?
That's really interesting. I've never made that connection. Are you saying for the left to feel that way, to feel anger? Yeah.
But I also think that that if his thesis, what you just said about his theory is accurate, we see this play out every single presidential election. It is we are hoping it's less that we want our guy to win. This is the whole lesser of two evils argument, right? It's actually about who is the more effective scapegoat. And for those who are not familiar, this whole idea of a scapegoat, this comes from Leviticus and the Old Testament, where on Passover, or not Passover, on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, Israel would pray all of the sins of the nation onto a single goat, and then that goat would be then sent out into the wilderness. Well, two goats. One would be sent out into the wilderness, and the other one would be sacrificed for atonement. So there's this expiation and propitiation imagery in both, and each one has an emphasis in either of in those respective directions. And so that, theologically speaking, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And it explains a heck of a lot of just our political discourse.
Well, but Girard would more start anthropologically and work with it anthropologically and then back into theology almost. So one of the things that he would said is that after the scapegoat mechanism happened, this would then become part of the group's mythology. The group creates a story that explains and justifies from their perspective as the persecutor why the scapegoat, who is truly a victim, is actually guilty and they deserved it. Whoa. It is interesting because even I think it was Harvey Kahn, he would talk about mythologies and how nation states were often started with these mythologies about how they overcame something and in order to unite together. And usually that would end up with them having to overlook the injustice that they had done in starting, and constituting themselves. I
mean, you could argue that King George III was the scapegoat for the founding of the American society and nation.
Yeah. So this is not a right-wing function. It's not a left-wing function. Girard's point was this is a human thing. This is just what we do. So a couple of examples. One would be McCarthyism in the 1950s. Okay. Who is our mimetic rivalry? The United States is in a mimetic rivalry with the Soviet Union. We're in a rivalry for control of the globe. Eventually there'd be a nuclear arms race. And Joseph McCarthy identifies that communists who are secretly living in the U.S., they are the problem. Let's hunt them down, identify them, and expel them from society. And as that happens, what happens? There's a sense of peace. Anxiety drops. We're finding our enemy and we're expelling them, and unity and peace are restored.
Yeah.
Okay, there's the scapegoat mechanism. But then our mythology we create around it, we have to get rid of them because they're infiltrating and threatening our society. Now, we got them out, okay? Now, but we look back and we're like, man, that was a pretty aggressive strategy. And some people who were accused of communism probably weren't communist. So this is where it interacts with like what Trevin's saying, right? We're seeing the scapegoat mechanism in real time as people draw tribal lines and kick people out who aren't exactly in their place, or purity spirals. And the weird thing is when the tribe expels someone, they don't experience it as violence or injustice. Rather, they experience it as purification and justice. Now, you can say this for 1950s McCarthyism. You can also say it for modern day cancel culture. Same thing, same process.
But before you jump into that, like, I'm wondering if, like, would you say that is part of what is connected to? I've heard Ryan Burge talk about how the rise of the nuns, NONES, and the spiritual but not religious, like, that started showing up on surveys really only because, and starting with the Soviet Union collapsing. So without that rivalry, because the communists are atheists, Americans are Christians, and there's a sense that rivalry actually solidified the identity and made that a default that wasn't really questioned. It was just assumed. And, there are trade-offs for that. Like, we can talk about nominalism and the way that was not helpful for the church or its discipleship and following Jesus. But I do wonder if does that sound like it would be related to what Girard's talking about?
Man, I'd have to really think about that. As I said, I'm actually reading people who are experts on Girard, but I am not. And so I'm still trying to figure out how it applies. But I really think there's so many implications. But where Girard starts off with anthropology, he sort of backs into theology and talks about the uniqueness of the gospel. As I said earlier, a lot of his work he saw eventually as an apologetic work for the gospel. So whereas every tribe's mythology, their story about themselves often protects the injustice that they've done. It legitimizes it, right? They deserved it. And it condemns the victim. What we did to them was deserved. We had to get them out. The story in the Gospels of Jesus is that he is chosen as the scapegoat instead of Barabbas, but over and over we're seeing that he's recognized not as guilty, but as innocent. Pilate, I wash my hands of this. This is an innocent man. So very interesting how Girard sees it. So we're in scapegoating, evil is justified. Okay. And the victim is actually seen as evil, right? Okay, here we have the resurrection of Christ that vindicates him as the victim. He actually was innocent. And only in the resurrection of Christ do we see a breaking of the scapegoat mechanism. Because though he was put out as the scapegoat, as the evil one, he rises from the dead as the innocent one.
Man.
He rises from the dead, not defeated, but in victory over death itself. And then, okay, trying to make some connections here to how the church can re-find itself in the midst of tribalism. So we're now a community of people not rooted in a unity around an accusation at some other tribe, but rather a unity in the one who was scapegoated, right, but was shown innocent, and then defeated our common enemy for us, even though he was pointed at by the Romans and the leaders of the temple as the enemy.
Dude, okay. Okay, I got to bring in double imputation.
Okay, go for it.
Right? Because exactly what you're talking about, not only was he the only innocent and actually fully innocent scapegoat, and that is how we view him because of the resurrection that you're talking about. But if that is true, and he didn't just take on all of our guilt and our condemnation, but he also gave us righteousness. That means that we don't actually need another scapegoat because of that once for all scapegoat. That means that for the Christian, when we are scapegoating, we are actually behaving contrary to the gospel.
Yes. Boom. Yes. So, I mean,
come on, dude.
yeah. So, okay, we're behaving contrary to the gospel. Why? Well, we have forgotten that the okay. Let me see if I run this back through.
You can draw a straight line from this back to the great dechurching. Like if our identity in Christ, because we are not receiving that identity and experiencing its blessing in the ordained institution that is the church, if we are dechurching, then that means that we don't ever have that continual reaffirmation and solidification of our identity in Christ and also our righteousness in Christ, and therefore our need to go and find scapegoats after receiving the scapegoat of Christ is actually like a symptom of our abandoning, our dechurching and abandoning of institutions. It is almost a confession of our insecurity.
I think it also points to the fact that we continually buy into stories that are much too small. So Jesus is the scapegoat, right? He is condemned, though innocent. He is condemned as the guilty one, and he is expelled and crucified. Yet he is actually victorious over our deepest enemy, not the tribe we don't like, but our deepest enemies of sin, death, and the devil. He rises from the dead in victory. He ascends to the right hand of God. He promises to return and make all things new, and there will be no more crying and no more pain. So when we look across the political aisle and we're like, that is the enemy that's going to ruin humanity, you're like, man, you've missed out on the gospel completely, right? Like, as bad as things could get, as evil as we are, as much as we can belittle and do evil against our neighbor, that can't stop the perspective that Christ is victorious over all of our common enemy, sin, death, and the devil. Just even in that, it makes us reframe how we view other human beings who are made in the image of God, who are also victims of the sin of this world. It's fallen to sin, of the fact that the devil is on a rampage, to destroy the image of God in people. And then thirdly, death, all of our enemy, death. Christ has defeated it for us. Is there something there for us that changes how we view other people?
Yes. I mean, I can't, like, to go back to what we were saying just a few minutes ago about how politics have kind of filled this vacuum. I think that this, among many things, I am sure, this means that we actually have, like, our discipleship, that if let me put it this way, if our efforts in discipleship do not bear the fruit of Christians refusing to opt into the scapegoating of anybody in the political realm, then I would say that there's something about our efforts in discipleship that are off and are at least insufficient or incomplete. And I think we have to connect those dots for people, because John, you're breaking my brain in a really good way with this stuff and connecting it with Trevin's articles, but we think about this all the time. Like, if you are not aware of this, you're never going to make that connection on your own. Like, we have to. This is huge. This has to inform our preaching. It has to inform, like, our small group discussions in the way that we, are able to name the ways in which, Trevin Wax says this in When the Tribe Eats the Church. He says, whether it's the fundamentalist enclave devolving into an online world of ever more radical right-wing beliefs, or the progressivist mindset devolving into little more than left-wing talking points baptized in Christian rhetoric, the appeal in both cases is the sense of community. It's the feeling of being beleaguered and outnumbered, pressing up against your compatriots in battle against the bad guys, that generates a sense of significance and purpose. what you just said about the way in which Jesus defeated sin and death on the cross and proved that that victory was sufficient in the resurrection. Our falling for the appeals to the sense of community and the need that we feel to make meaning by pressing up against our compatriots in battle against the bad guys to generate senses of significance and purpose, that is again a confession of our insecurity in Christ. It's a confession that actually we believe, but Lord, help our unbelief, because we clearly don't believe it enough to receive the significance, meaning, and purpose that is promised in the gospel of being in Christ.
Right, and that insecurity can be formed around the threat of our mimetic rival, right? So everything from like, hey, I have a rival at work and I can't let them show me up, to there are two tribes in our society who want the same thing, actually. But what happens is, like, we're kind of looking forward and thinking about loss. What happens if this tribe takes what I want or what we want, rather than looking back and going, Jesus already gained for us the victory that we all need. So,
wow.
Honestly,
that's fear, not hope. Yeah.
Yeah. If another tribe steps in and, like, let's say, ruins your tribe, okay, I'm not downplaying that, because if you start to do the examples of that through history, there's real human suffering and real pain and real death.
Sure.
At the same time, to hold it in tension with the fact that Christ has defeated death, right? And so I think we just, I think the fact that the tribe eating the church shows that we are just believing a story. We're living in a story that's way too small and fundamentally doesn't have the death, resurrection, ascension, and promised return of Christ as the center of its story.
I love that so much, man. And having just preached through Daniel chapters 1 through 7, I mean, there are a few examples in Scripture where the existential threat of a conquering empire is a better illustration of, like, what our fear actually is, but in a way that is way more actual and severe compared to our circumstances. And in the midst of that, right, God tells Jeremiah to tell Israel, plant gardens. Right? Build your houses, give your sons and daughters away in marriage, have more children, be fruitful and multiply. Like, it's almost a restatement of the cultural mandate. And he's saying, like, in the midst of that, be confident, like, do not be afraid. But that command to don't be afraid, do not fear, is not so that you can go kick Nebuchadnezzar's butt, right?
Yes, right.
It's so that you can actually focus on the ways in which God promises to be faithful and provide through, which is that institution building. That's why the greenhouse analogy is so effective and so helpful for so many people, because that's what it's a greenhouse that Jeremiah is telling Israel, build a greenhouse in this Mars-like landscape that is not conducive or hospitable to your way of life or your faith. Just trust God enough that he's going to set a table in the midst of your enemies and he will provide for you. And not only that, going forward to Christ, it's not just protecting you with that table in the midst of your enemies. It's also that table is to which enemies are invited into because of the gospel.
Oh, geez. Yeah.
Right? So we're not just resisting enemies. We're actually, in Christ, able to love them.
Yeah.
Not to destroy them, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't mean we don't resist. That doesn't mean we compromise, right? That is not an implication. What you're talking about, John, what we're trying to talk about now, and what I think Girard is onto, is a freedom to take on a posture of hospitality rather than a freedom to burn down and destroy first.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we can only do that if we have a perspective that's outside of our moment, where we're looking back to the cross and what Christ has won, but we're also pointing our desire, like we're recognizing that we do have desire. We're recognizing our tendency to scapegoat those who get in the way of our mimetic desires. But that ultimately desire isn't wrong. Our desires are actually just too small. So Hebrews 11:16 says desire, like let your desire run wild. But here's what it says. But as it is, they, the exiles, the exiled people of God living on earth, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. It's the longings of our heart that actually, that James talks about, that actually create enemies, because it's longings and desires run wild. But desire isn't bad. It's just not pointed at the right place. And when we point it at the right place, we'll actually find the fulfillment of our desires when Christ returns in ways that we could never imagine.
I mean, on this side of Easter, and the way, like with what Trevin Wax was talking about in his articles around this gap between the world that ought to be and the world that is, it is actually the antidote to the frustration that comes from that idealism, is the guarantee that because Christ is risen, we know that the world that ought to be is on its way, that he is even now making all things new. And that at the end of the story, that big cosmic story is characterized by redemption and is epitomized in the new heavens and new earth, in the new Jerusalem coming down, where there is no need for light because the light of Christ shines throughout, right? It is a truncation of cosmic redemption that is the root of our dysfunction. Our inability to, because we're not rehearsing the stories on Sunday morning, we're not able to see the glimpses of that story amidst all the countercultural narratives. Let's go, man.
Yeah. Man.
At this point, let's invite the worship team onto the stage while we pray, and
all the people of God said amen.
Yeah, man. Because I think this is right, and I think that this is what is encouraging to me, and I think that Trevin is right to point out in his articles, is that there is we need to affirm the impulse toward deriving identity from our belonging, but we need to encourage people to redirect it toward the church, because that is the only way, that's the only place where belonging is thick enough to provide the meaning, significance, and purpose that we are feeling so empty and longing for. Amen.
Brother, a rich conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for your insights. And
likewise.
Hey, yeah. And we'll see you next time on Post Everything.
Sounds good. See you then.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening. If you found this episode helpful, text it to a friend. Please take a minute and rate this podcast. Leaving a review helps other people find us and connect. You can send us questions or feedback by emailing us at posteverythingpod@gmail.com. Thank you.